in 2023. It's considered the winter time now, and in this video I wanted to talk about some things I'd like to watch during the winter time. It's mostly stuff in the horror, thriller genre. Now, some of these I'm going to talk about, I am probably not covering a lot of the essentials, but this is just simply my list, things I like to watch, and I'm more than all ears to hear what you like to watch during the winter time. But some of these I also don't have physical copies of, but ones that, are on certain streaming services. But let's get started. So first one I'm gonna recommend is actually an episode of The Twilight Zone, and if you've watched this channel before, I've covered The Twilight Zone several times, but it is my favorite episode of The Twilight Zone, and it's called Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up? And takes place during the winter time. There's snow falling everywhere during this episode, but it's about two cops. They get a call about an unidentified flying object that landed in some pond. They go and investigate it, and they see some footprints leading out of the pond. They follow the footprints into a diner, and they pretty much have to figure out who in this diner happens to be a Martian from outer space. It's a fun whodunit. I love a good whodunit, and a lot of the wintry atmosphere is all over this episode, even though it is just these people basically isolated in this diner and during a snowstorm. Like, you really feel the snow and, being snowed in type feeling in this episode. Like, everyone's got their coats on still and, being cozy and drinking lots and lots of coffee. And, the two cops just basically talking to everyone, trying to investigate what's going on here. And, this is episode happened a long time ago, so I won't spoil it, but some aspects of it I feel like a lot of people could figure out. But first time me watching it, I had a blast with it, and ever since I watch it all the time and watch it during the winter time. So if you like a good whodunit with a good wintry atmosphere, you might like this episode. Next up is going to be one that is by Oz Perkins, the director. He directed a movie called The Blackcoat's Daughter, which came out in 2015, I believe. Now, this is one that is not going to be for everybody, but pretty much this movie is all winter atmosphere, and especially it is a very slow burn type film. I always enjoy it. I love slow burn type films. I like movies that are suspenseful, but they're not just pure noise. They're not noise factories. And this is one that I think the director Oz Perkins, who's Anthony Perkins' son, Anthony Perkins from Psycho, at least a lot of the movies that he's directed have been very, very slow burns. Like, he did The Blackcoat's Daughter, he did I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House, and then he went on to do Gretel and Hansel. And all three of those movies are very slow in its build. And Blackcoat's Daughter, I think, was like the first one he did, at least as a director. And I enjoy this movie, but it's pretty much just this girl who's at this school. It's their winter break, and everyone is going home, and her parents are nowhere to be found, pretty much. And what goes on from there, I don't really want to give away, but it goes from there where she's just kind of left alone at this school. And it involves these other girls that are also at the school. But I enjoy it for what it is. If you just want kind of more of a quiet movie and that has a very wintry atmosphere, you might enjoy this one. But I will say, this is definitely one that isn't for everyone. If you're like screaming at the screen to be like, something happened, like, this isn't the movie for you. So yeah, The Blackcoat's Daughter. Next up is one I actually did have a physical copy of, but ever since moving into this house, I haven't been able to find all of my DVDs, and I'm still looking. Like, we have a bunch of boxes in the basement I still have to look through, but that is the movie Let the Right One In, that I don't have a physical copy of right now, and I have to find it. But this is one of my favorite movies of all time, and it involves, two characters. One guy, Oscar, he's bullied at school and doesn't really have any friends. And then this new girl ends up moving into his apartment building that he lives at. And her name's Ellie, and he pretty much slowly finds out that she is a vampire. And, Twilight really ruined vampires for a lot of people, but this is an extremely good movie. And all during the winter time. There's snow everywhere. The atmosphere is amazing. I love wintry atmosphere in movies, and this is probably, that definitely contributes to why this is like one of my favorite movies ever. It's a slow burn, but it's also one of those movies that, you know, it is very much horror. It is really horrific. There are some really suspenseful moments, but it, at its core, it really is a love story. And like just the relationship between Oscar and Ellie are just, it's really, really well done. So if you want something a little bit different, and while it is horror, but it has a little more depth to it, definitely check out Let the Right One In. So next up of my non having a physical copy is one that's not a straight up like horror movie, but I like to consider it in kind of the same genre. Like when you think of movies that you're isolated in one place, this is a movie I always go to, and that is Quentin Tarantino's The Hateful Eight. And it's about, you know, a group of, you know, this is very much a Western just taking place during winter time, but it's like a bunch of Western characters just being held up and snowbound in this cabin. And the whole movie, from the dialogue to the suspense to, you know, that, you know, no one's really fully trusting one another. It is really, really good. And there is an extended cut on Netflix where they kind of divide it up into episodes almost, which is kind of cool because it is a long movie from its original cut. And even though they made an extended edition, they broke it up into like separate episodes. So if you don't have time to watch the whole thing through, you can break it up into the episodes, and it does still work really well. And everything from, I love just, you get, you know, certain characters that go from, you know, traveling in the snow with a blizzard like right behind them practically, to getting safe into this cabin and dealing with these other strangers. And there's a lot of suspense. You don't know what's gonna happen really. And, you know, some pretty funny dialogue. I mean, I'm not really a huge Quentin Tarantino fan, but I really enjoy this movie. And how it escalates, it does get pretty horrific, and, you know, a lot of things that do happen. And like there ends up being a lot of blood towards the end of the movie, but the build-up is really, really well done. And I love watching this movie during the winter time, just due to them just being trapped in this cabin. It's freezing outside, and, you know, it's like, would we rather take our chances out in a snowstorm, or do we have to deal with these crazy people that are, you know, in the same room as us? So it's definitely one worth checking out if you want to give that a chance. All right, and moving on to my physical copies of stuff I like to watch during the winter. Speaking of the last movie, The Hateful Eight, actually there was a lot of leftover music from this movie that ended up being basically the soundtrack to The Hateful Eight. And speaking of being held up, snowbound in, you know, a certain location, that is John Carpenter's The Thing. I would say this and The Shining, which I'll talk about in a little bit, are pretty much the ultimate winter horror movies. The Thing is just, you know, whether dealing with something that just shapeshifts into anything it can be, and taking the form of one of your crew members or anything. It's like, on top of that, you're just literally snowbound in just this terrible weather, and, you know, having to deal with this threat. But, you know, you hear endless things about this in the horror genre, but I would consider this to be one of the best horror movies ever made. It really is. It's so good. I love how open-ended the ending is. And yeah, I mean, you can't say enough good things about it. It's just one of those movies where, like, if someone's like, give me a good horror movie, and I usually recommend, you know, classics first, and if they've never seen The Thing, I'd just be like, just go watch it, you know. And it's not only just a great horror movie, but if you're like, hey, I'm snowbound in my house right now and I need a good movie, this one's definitely got you covered. All right, and then The Shining. Yeah, Shining is another example of just recommended to anyone who hasn't seen it. This is, I forget like who said it. I think it might have been Larry King, but on the back of this movie, in quotes, it says the first epic horror film. I would definitely agree with that, because this movie is long. It's like, I think like 2.5 hours, but it entices you every step of the way. Like, not only is it just every character is really great in it, but the build up to, you know, Jack's descent into madness is great. And, you know, just having him, his wife, and kid just being held up in the Overlook Hotel during this crazy blizzard of a winter. And, you know, they have nowhere to go. And, you know, I love movies like this, obviously. I mean, most of the ones I'm talking about, they're just stuck in one location. But it's pretty hard to pull off, in my opinion. Like, if you are just stuck in one location, it's like, you better entertain me somehow. And The Shining definitely does that, and The Thing does that, and The Hateful Eight does that, and there's at least one other movie that also does that. So, but The Shining, can't say enough good things about it. Just, you can find endless, you know, YouTube videos talking about things super in depth, but I would just say, don't watch the documentary Room 237. That's all about like conspiracy theories surrounding The Shining. And to me, that just doesn't make any sense. But The Shining, just watch it. It's great. Next up is one I don't think a lot of people have checked out. And this is also one that I wouldn't consider for everyone. And this was a movie that was definitely mismarketed in its trailers and everything. It was, of course, marketed as a horror movie, but I wouldn't consider it actually straight up horror. But it's from Guillermo del Toro, and that is Crimson Peak. And Crimson Peak very much is a gothic romance. It just happens to have like ghostly things and some horrific elements to it. Like, it is bloody in parts. Like, Guillermo del Toro is one of these people where he makes a gorgeous looking movie, but in that beauty, he adds a lot of horror to it. And like, there's a lot of graphic violence in his movies. Like, he did that with The Shape of Water, Pan's Labyrinth. He did that a little with Crimson Peak as well. But Crimson Peak, yeah, is very much a gothic romance at, you know, its core. But if you want just a really good looking movie that has, it's not in the wintertime, at least in the first bit of the movie, but there are aspects that it just reminds me of winter when I am watching this movie. So, I mean, this is definitely one when it is colder out. And, you know, yeah, it makes me, I don't know, it's just hard to explain for me, but like, movies like this remind me of the wintertime, or like, you know, ones that are just a little more subdued and, you know, tell a little more of a story and are, you know, a little more subtle than just other horror movies. Like, this is one I like to watch around the winter time. So check it out. If that sounds appealing to you, you will probably like it. If you're like, I want more scares, you're probably not going to be, you may be disappointed by this one, honestly. But Crimson Peak is still a very good movie, and if you like Guillermo del Toro and you haven't seen this, you'll probably take a liking to this one. And finally is one that takes place in pretty much one location, and that is Stephen King's Misery. And both Kathy Bates and James Caan are amazing in this movie. I mean, and if you don't know the story of Misery, it's just a guy who is an author. He's trying to drive home in a snowstorm, and his car goes off the road and he gets completely wrecked. And pretty much if he wasn't rescued, he would most likely end up dead. But good old Kathy Bates here comes to the rescue, rescues this guy who happens to be a huge fan of all his books. And, you know, turns out she's kind of a crazy fan. And Stephen King kind of wrote the story of Misery just about how crazy fandom can be about stuff. And it is definitely a good message to have of just like, it's, hey, we're, you know, people are appreciative of their fans, but it's like, you know, they are human beings at the end of the day. Like, you got to give them a break sometimes. So, but this movie is just great suspense. Like, the James Caan's character is just like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? So he kind of has to fake, like, you know, he really is happy to be with, you know, Kathy Bates and everything. And, you know, some pretty terrible things happen to him, including broken bones. But because of his wreck in a snowstorm, you know, he ends up being isolated at, you know, Kathy Bates' character's house. And I love it. It's great. And this is just a good reminder to myself, in a way, to watch these movies, because it is January now. You know, the holidays are over. And I didn't want to talk about like Christmas horror movies, because most Christmas horror movies obviously have a snowy, wintry atmosphere. But like, you know, the holidays are over. So it's like, you know, what are like just movies that have a wintry atmosphere that aren't Christmas? And the ones I was just talking about, I think are good ones. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. Recommend some ones to me that I didn't mention on here. I'm sure I'm missing a lot, but these are just ones that I think are definitely good to watch around the winter time. But I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I will see you in a future video. Thank you for watching. Bye.